Is possible.
Tracy McMillan was there. She was with us at the time, but then Miha was Miha.
As we come in, we know that it can be a little noisy as we recongregate, and we appreciate your help to quietly take your seats. And so many of you are sitting close to the middle so that others can fill in as well. Thank you for doing that. Bless you. Okay, a couple of quick announcements that are kind of important. A reminder, both those who are joining us by webcast and so fully participating as we heard, as well as those who, like me, are fortunate to be in the room today, please remember your Slido app. Go out and reset with the new code for this panel that we're going to introduce in just a moment. Second, to aid our panelists, as well as all of us in the room, so that we have as much interaction as possible, the panelists and their moderator have agreed they're going to do their best to keep their prepared remarks to that 5 minutes or less. And Alika, are you going to be helping with this? Fantastic. Could you stand up so we can introduce you on our CTC team? Alika is from a local partnership program and now on active transportation program as well. Thanks for your service. And as a reminder, panelists, if you weren't able to join us yesterday, we're thrilled that you're here today. You're going to be helped to be good stewards of our collective time. Alika will let you know when you have 2 minutes left, and then 1 minute left, and then 30 seconds, and then you'll get a very gentle time is up slide, and then a less subtle let it go slide. Does that work for everyone? Good. This next topic that Kayvon is going to be moderating is on the issue of safety. And when I looked at the amazing agenda for both days, my eyes went there. September 7 of this year, I was on a 62-mile charity bike ride on Highway 1 with 2,000 other cyclists, and we were turning a hill and ascending that hill, and my wife was on my wheel, and we were commenting that the motorhome was getting closer and closer and closer. And our choice was not that great because it was motorhome or gravel and falling into the Pacific Ocean far below. And the motorhome hit me. And it hurt. And it was surreal because she kept saying, my wife kept saying, he's going to hit you, he's going to hit you, he's going to hit you. And he must have heard her because he said, okay, I guess I'll hit this guy. Fortunately, I didn't go off my bike and therefore over the side of the cliff. But weeks of back, neck, head, and shoulder pain, I was lucky. I know I'm not alone. How many people in this room have been in a crash as well? The last time, a week before Thanksgiving in our Silicon Valley turkey trot, I was hit and spent a few months with a fractured hip and elbow in a wheelchair. So it impacts all of us as we are out there. And so I was so drawn by this particular panel where I think we all have a lot to learn as cyclists and active transportation practitioners, human beings, on how we can do better, as well as how we can help our communities do better. For me, it's both. When I see people on my 17-mile each way, each day bicycle commute, when I see other cyclists who I'm sure are good people blow through stop signs and blow through traffic lights, I have to wonder, is your life more important than the 15 seconds you just saved? So we can all learn, can't we? But one thing I have learned, John Brazil taught me this in our area, if it's still true. John, you're here today still, correct? John Brazil? Yeah. That it's roughly half and half between who is quote unquote at fault between a cyclist and a car when a crash happens. But it's not half and half on who gets injured more, metal or flesh. So again, I want to thank this great panel and Kayvon, our moderator, and I'm going to turn it over to them at this time. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kayvon Shafazada. I'm the Associate Dean for the College of Engineering and Computer Science at Sacramento State, and I also happen to be a transportation engineer who serves as a moderator for the Active Transportation Committee for the Active Transportation Plan. We have a great panel in front of you this morning focusing on transportation safety. This is one of the larger panels. You have bios for most of the speakers, so I'm going to do brief introductions. Before we do that, though, I want to point you to the Slido poll that we have, trying to get a better idea of who's with us both in person and remotely, trying to find out who you represent. So make sure you go to, with each session, there's a new Slido poll or a new Slido session. So we're now in Slido session 1033. Make sure you go in there and then find the poll to identify who you represent. So it looks like we have quite a mix of state, local, and MPO governments, which is great, which is kind of what we expected, but we weren't sure. So after this poll, go ahead, you're going to need to switch back into the Q&A session for Slido. A lot of the questions from our previous session are related to this session, but those questions don't transfer over. So if you have a question that you didn't get answered in the previous session that this panel may be better suited to answer, feel free to restate your question or feel free to like it or agree with it so that it rises to the top. Slido is something that we're trying for the first time to see if we can't get audience participation from those that weren't able to make it physically here today. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel. Our first set of speakers, we have a tandem. Rod Brown is an ACIP and a PTP and is an associate at Farron Piers in the Roseville office. Joining Rod, we have Megan Mittmund, who is an AICP and a principal and operations manager also for Farron Piers in the Walnut Creek office. So Farron Piers representing, we've got some consulting here. Next, we have Ofer Grembeck, who is a researcher and lecturer at UC Berkeley and is the co-director of the university's Safe Transportation Research and Education Center, or SafeTrek. Joining him is Jill Cooper. She is the other co-director at SafeTrek, and she focuses on multidisciplinary traffic safety and injury prevention planning. And then lastly, not to forget the rural perspective, we're thrilled to have Jerry Barton join us. He's a senior transportation planner for El Dorado County, the El Dorado County Transportation Commission. So without any further ado, let's get started. I'll hand this to you, and I'll switch over. Okay.
Great, thank you. I want to start by acknowledging some of the work that went into this. Some of the folks that helped. Yep. Thank you. Thank you for the reminder. Hopefully everybody can hear me now. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the work we've done for Caltrans, and with that, I want to acknowledge Rachel Carpenter and Nika Jezzy at Caltrans, who sponsored this work, and also Ofer Grembeck, who you'll hear from shortly as well, who is also developed some of the tools that we're using here. So the work that you're going to see here is building upon some work that was done previously for Caltrans. There was a hotspot analysis that was done a couple years ago that identified a number of locations based on previous collision history and identified a number of actions to improve the conditions at those locations. So what we did, and I apologize, it looks like the slides didn't come through with all the graphics here. But what we did was expand that analysis beyond the reactive approach that was done looking at existing collisions to expand that to look at the characteristics of those existing conditions and provide new locations where previous work, where there had not been a previous history of collisions to say that In these locations, we could proactively apply treatments to prevent future collisions in those locations. So we're moving along the spectrum from this hotspot analysis in a reactive condition to a more proactive analysis looking at systemic safety and safe systems. Oh, there's a build here, all right. The work that we're doing here, it falls into FHWA's systemic safety program. So there are several steps in this. First, the analysis that we did looked at crash types and risk factors to identify the characteristics of those collisions that were common. And then what we did was take those characteristics and apply those to the state highway system to say that although collisions in these locations have not happened in the past, these locations have similar characteristics and could have these in the future. So using that then, or using those locations, we were able to identify countermeasures that are applicable to those types of collisions and to locations with those characteristics. And then what we did was prioritize projects based on a number of factors. So what we're looking at here is a basic level of that analysis, or a sort of a simplified version of that. So what you see here are sort of three factors that fall into this. So one, we're looking at one type of facility, which is an intersection. We're looking at the type of controls that are on there. So there are stop controls or signalized controls, for example. We looked at the number of approach lanes on those intersections as a factor feeding into this. And then we looked at the average traffic on those. So all those factors then went into this analysis to identify the locations with the most frequency of collisions. We took that as an input into a prioritization, and we combined a number of factors along with the collision rate, including exposure, as well as the populations that were subject to those collisions, including the most impacted communities in that, so disadvantaged communities, seniors, and youth. So after that, after those locations I've identified, we worked with Caltrans to do some training as well to apply those countermeasures. And now I'm going to hand it to Megan to talk about that.
So to go along with the systemic model, hopefully you can hear me, to go along with this list of prioritized locations, both reactive and systemic, we created a countermeasure toolbox. It's showing the screen. Let me just use yours. Sure. Okay. Better, right? Nope. That's okay. So we created a kind of a complementary effort, which was a countermeasure toolbox to say, now that we have this prioritized list of locations, both reactive and proactive on the state highway system, what is the toolbox of countermeasures, and what is a how-to guide for selecting the collision reduction factor to be able to make a decision on what kind of the highest and most effective treatment could be for that context. And then we taught these classes 3 times across the state to be able to go through that how-to guide and the selection of the collision countermeasures to be able to help the investigators who are going to be given these lists in each of the different districts to know how to go about matching the countermeasures to the list of priority locations that they were going to be given. Go to the next slide, please. So what's next? So one of the key challenges, I think, when we're doing the systemic safety was that our ability to create these typologies and to really extrapolate from the reactive list to the proactive is really based on the amount of data that we had. And so there's a really big push right now to get a better sense of the infrastructure data and the contextual setting of the locations that have had crashes to be even more predictive and more illustrative in terms of what types of countermeasures we'd select in the future for systemic. Also a goal of doing a similar process on the bicycle side, and writing a strategic agenda for Caltrans for pedestrian and bicycle safety that really takes the opportunity for this process that we went through to create these different tools and these countermeasures and say, well, what else would we have liked to have been in that toolbox? What are some of the feedback we got as we were teaching these classes on maybe some of the institutional challenges and shortcomings and opportunities to really put forward a prioritized agenda for improving pedestrian and bicycle safety in the future. So those are some of the things that are up next.
Hold the button.
Let's try this one. Hold the button. Oh, great. So it doesn't have a light, but it does work. just an example of how sometimes systems don't quite work as they're designed. So in my 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about the safe system approach, what it means for vulnerable road users, and then a little bit about the opportunities that are created or potentially created by intelligent intersections. And my first slide is really a hard slide because it echoes so many of the things that Leah already said, and she says it so well. So kind of, I'm almost tempted to say what she said for this slide, but I will just try to quickly go through some points that would be more important for my subsequent slides. So the goal of the, or maybe before that, another point. So here we're referring to the safe system approach. And a few years back, when we started looking into Vision Zero, safe system, and what are these sibling philosophies, concepts, approaches provide, we gravitated a lot more to the safe system approach. And part of it was because we kept on hearing that the term Vision Zero has some sensitivity to it. And that because they're very, very similar. And I have to say that today, or at least in the past year, I don't hear those sensitivities anymore. So I think a lot of the credit needs to go to organizations like Leah's and many other people that are doing similar work to make sure that the term does not come with the sensitivities and people just take the time to understand what that means. And what it means is that the goal is to build a system on which no one can be severely or fatally injured on. And as said before, it's kind of a holistic approach with the desirable outcome of 0 deaths. And the two main items that I like to emphasize that the safe system approach acknowledges are related to limitation or human limitations. The first one, they're both illustrated in a square in this figure. The first one is the human tolerance to physical force, and that's directly related to the kinetic energy that's carried by various road users and is to a large extent unsurvivable by humans. According to this approach, the way to address that is a combination of factors labeled here as safer roads. That's the bottom right oval. On the left, safer vehicles. And then the third one is safer speeds. And the important thing to note here is it's not the important thing is that these three need to be aligned. So if you're able to build high standard roads or roads with a high safety standard, and you're able to manufacture vehicles with a high safety standards to protect the occupants and non-occupants, then you put your system in a position that it can accommodate higher safe speeds. It does not mean just higher speeds, but you can go at speeds that would be safe for this triangle of factors. And that's kind of point one. And the second one is that the rectangle on the right, alert and compliant users, which is what we expect our users to do, to be alert and compliant. But as Leah said, at some point we will mess up. So the system needs to accommodate enough buffers for those situations that, for the most part, unintentionally, we make mistakes. So how does this help us think about traffic safety? And we have here a little narrative that kind of draws information from these approaches. And what it says is that, oh, did I lose the microphone? Yeah. Is it back? Yeah. Okay. That we would want alert and compliant. So this is from, it helps us identify the safety considerations that we would want to take into account. So for the example of cyclist safety, we would want alert and compliant riders to make trips using safe bicycles on safe street design with adequate separation from safe motorized vehicles, driven by alert and compliant drivers, all of which are governed by safe speeds and supported by effective cyclist protection and the medical emergency system when needed. So it's kind of a narrative that helps us, there's so many things that we need to take into account, and they're not independent from each other. And when we try to distill it more to a more kind of linear framework, we come up with a list of opportunities to build buffers in this system. It starts with a street design, which is probably the most effective and important aspect, followed by street operations, which is where speed comes in. And again, it needs to be aligned with the street design, then street user behavior, and then more mitigative buffers or layers related to street user warning and street user protection, and eventually the emergency medical system. And the challenge when we come to think about all these things is that, as Rod and Megan already said, a lot of the information that we have is coming from crashes. And that is, again, reactive. So what we're doing with the intelligent intersection opportunity, we're figuring out how can we use instrumented intersections. In this example, it's in pavement sensors, but can also be videos, to quantify what is the safety performance of a location, irrespective of events that are happening. And in this example, we kind of focused on analyzing yielding behavior during right turn on green events. So the instrumented intersection has sensors for the vehicles, but also on the sidewalk. So we're able to identify and quantify yielding events. We're calling it safety critical interactions between different modes. And what we were able to do here is not just quantify what is the yielding rate, we're able to separate we learned that there are different types of yielding. All the way on the left, there's yielding at the stop line, which is as it is supposed to be. Then in the middle, there's yielding at right turns area. We're kind of calling it aggressive yielding. You still yield, but you kind of push on the pedestrian. And then eventually there are non-yielding events. And we're able to run that system in a continuous long-term manner so that we can monitor what is the value for each of these type of yieldings. And when we compare it across different jurisdictions, different intersections, we're able to see, this intersection, we're seeing it has some problem as what we're referring to as surrogate safety measures, and we would want to send practitioners to go to that site before something bad happens so that we can assess it and figure out if there are ways to improve it before a crash actually happens. So to summarize it, there are ways to utilize technology in a way that would allow us to generate something that's comparable to a blood works to an intersection, and would allow us to quantify if the performance, not as it relates to crashes, but as it relates to safety critical interactions, is not sufficient, and then we'll be able to use that to improve that location, but also more systemically to use that to improve locations with a very similar layout. Thank you.
This one has a light. Okay, hello, good morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about web tools that we've designed at UC Berkeley SafeTrack for use by communities to learn more about traffic safety problems in their communities, as well as to inform and to communicate traffic safety problems in their communities that might not otherwise be collected. So I'll talk about a couple of tools we've developed. One is Street Story, and one is TIMS, the Transportation Injury Mapping System. And because I forgot a slide with the URLs, I'll just say now, Street Stories at streetstory.berkeley.edu, and TIMS is at tims.berkeley.edu, or you can catch me after the presentation. So both tools are, well, Street Story is used to collect information that's basically crowdsourced information from communities. It's a community engagement tool to get to get people to think about traffic safety and to communicate it. And it's a central repository for traffic safety concerns in communities. TIMS is a tool that geocodes the police traffic data and allows users to map it and look at tables and collision severity and so on. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Street Story in action. In general, as a community engagement tool, we know that if many of you, if you're from public agencies, nonprofit agencies, holding community meetings is a really hard way, but an important way to get community input. And it might be that you have the same people coming again and again to community meetings, and you want to work to extend that. So when we partner with community agencies like Bakersfield, for example, in the Central Valley, we work with them so that they can go out to their constituents, gather input, get people to come to community meetings, or take it, as you see on the upper left corner, we'll go clockwise, on walk audits to gather information about collisions that they might have seen or been in, hazardous places that don't get collected elsewhere, near misses, and also safe places. So it's an iPad. The next picture is it's web-based. It can be used on mobile phones, on iPads, for use during walk audits, community meetings, or for someone who has an experience on the road, goes home and enters it. We've gone backward from the technology to develop a paper version, because what we've heard from a lot of people is that when you're tabling, as in the next slide, it's really helpful to have something that people can distribute easier. There are many people who might not want to use the technology, might not trust it, and so the paper version's a way to gather the information, then we'll enter it into, or the community agency we work with will enter it. The right lower slide is a picture of the Coalition for Transportation Priorities in Humboldt County. They've done a lot of outreach. They did a training for public agencies, community people, and the media on how to apply street story in Humboldt County. And then it makes it a central repository for them to use to lobby professionals, elected officials, and so on about safety priorities. Bakersfield in Kern County is using it in the same way. It's a way to get information from multiple institutions, multiple jurisdictions in one place to communicate what the needs are. The last slide on the lower left is a slide from the Street Story website that shows the where entries have been made. So you can see there's a strong cluster up in the far north, the south, as well as the Central Valley. And then this is TIMS, our Transportation Injury Mapping System. These are some available tools for you. We have there's SWITR's mapping capability. We do use SWITR's, provisional SWITR's data, so it's current through 2018. It allows you to draw collision diagrams, to look at collision severity, to look at clusters. There's a Safe Routes to School map viewer that looks at collisions within a half mile and a mile of public schools in California. There's an ATP tool that those of you who have applied for ATP grants might have used that allow you to draw polygons around areas, and we'll be experimenting with using Street Story to collect some of that information as well. There's a motorcycle viewer map, and then for those of you from tribal agencies, there's a tool that individual tribal agencies can use to gather data on tribal lands. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, hello everyone. Good morning, and just to kind of continue the theme of yesterday and appreciation, I just want to express appreciation for the opportunity to be able to be here and speak about the unique challenges in rural areas. We have a very large state of California, and it's very diverse, and we all have and come from different experiences. The map on the right, the blue area is generally the urban areas of California, and the brown and tan areas are rural, and so as you can see, that makes up quite a large geography and portion of our state. Nonetheless, we are all here together to advance bicycling and walking throughout our great state, and to have more and safer trips by bike. So back to the theme of kind of talking about the unique challenges of rural areas. Our road system was designed for resource extraction, logging, mining, agriculture, et cetera. And as these demands for those types of economic activities have declined, we're seeing more development and it's essentially a lot of use on these roadways that were originally designed for a different activity. And also in rural areas, there's an extreme community pride. Surprisingly, a lot of the people who live there moved from urban areas, and they really like their quiet streets and dark streets and the fact that there isn't sidewalks. In fact, I was at a public meeting recently, and some people were saying, "You're not considering putting sidewalks on our road, are you?" And it's a road that has a high school on it. So, surprise. Rural survey data, the safety factors in a recent survey for interested but concerned bicyclists, number one concern was speed of nearby motor vehicles. That's because a lot of the streets are very narrow and people's experience on those roads is very scary. Traffic volume is another. And so we have a lot of non-standard designs. This particular sidewalk's in front of a home built in 1936. And that's pretty non-standard today. We have access control challenges, a sort of a lack of designation of where pedestrians and bicyclists should be, and this particular intersection is pretty decent, but you know, the driveway entrance, these long and vast driveway entrances are sort of a no man's land for a pedestrian. We have really constrained roadway segments. A friend of mine, Lynn Murray, rolls his wheelchair down this road very regularly. The speed limit is 35 miles an hour, and there's a creek on the right and obviously a retaining wall supporting some houses on the left. And so this is a really serious engineering challenge and a very expensive improvement. And there is a high-density development up to the right, and there's a park at the top of the street and more high-density development. So, but a lot of people, surprisingly, they just don't have that the concern for others or, you know, awareness to actually drive slow through there. It's pretty obvious to me, but not for everyone, unfortunately. We have a lot of developing areas and development patterns that are piecemealed together and sidewalks that are discontinuous. High-speed crossings, this is a 50-mile-an-hour road segment, and it is a school crossing. There's a school on either side of both of these roads and a development on the other side. And a incident here would be extremely tragic. We have narrow shoulders, no surprise there. That woman walking her daughter to school is on the other side of that high-speed crossing I just showed in the previous picture. A lot of times just maintaining shoulders is a very helpful thing just to create improved sight distance and create a little bit more space for someone to walk or bicycle. I have an advocate that continually says, when you maintain the roads, can you just push the asphalt out just a little bit more here or there, so we just have a little bit of a reprieve from a tight corner or something. This is one thing that's important to point out, is that we have few clusters of incidents, and so our incidents, crashes are fairly random, and that's kind of demonstrated in this map, and that seems to be pretty consistent. Some of these opportunities that I had put down before I heard the Vision Zero presentation may be less relevant at this moment, but I do think that creative engineering solutions are really important, and if we can do things that are context sensitive like this, these sort of clay-colored bike lanes, that really are fitting of the community area and something that people can get behind, that really provides a nice walkway and bikeway for people. This particular area also, they didn't want a sidewalk, but we managed to get the asphalt pathway in and the bike lane and crossing. I really am a big fan of the idea of a uphill class 2 and a downhill sharrow in really constrained places. I think that could be a great solution to provide the bicycling needs, provide for bicycling needs, as well as walking, provide a safe place for people to walk. Good thing about rural areas is we do have room for Class 1 facilities, and they're very, very expensive to build. And so fortunately, we have active transportation program money, way more than when I started my career. I think it was 15 million statewide for the BTA. So I'll leave it here with this list of challenges for you to think about, and thank you very much for your time.
Okay, with that, we will open it up to questions. We have the Slido session going, again, session 1033.
We can remind people with microphones, if you hold it close to your chin, both microphones are on and at full volume. It's just perhaps holding it a little closer.
Hi, Leah Shahan with the Vision Zero Network. Thank you for your presentations. I'd love to ask you all that worked on the state systemic analysis work that is pretty recently out, how do you expect that will be used? How do you recommend folks, for instance, say at the local level, engage with that? What do you see as kind of being next? You talked about kind of the bike piece, et cetera, et cetera. For what exists, what should be next? How can we really utilize that to a good advantage?
Great question.
Sure. So the next steps in that are with these priorities, these are going to be given to the districts. And the districts, sorry, I need to keep my mouth up here too while I look at you. These are going to be given to the districts. In accompaniment with the training, they will then identify countermeasures for those and go out and address those particular locations. Now, that's very focused on the state highway system. Part of what they're being encouraged to do is to work with the local folks as well to identify solutions for those locations, to get some of the contextual data, not just looking at the state highway system, but to look at the land uses around there. I mean, some of these locations are in, for example, some of these rural communities where the state highway might be a main street through the town. So it's important to, as well, work with the local communities to understand that context when we're putting those solutions together.
I think another discussion that we're having, and we're having at the federal highway level, and a project that we're working on with Leah is going to be, as we move towards systemic safety and think about the Highway Safety Improvement Program, HSIP funding, how do we address benefit cost analysis, right? Because right now, that's the way that you're able to rank high for those projects that you might submit through that, is to do a benefit cost analysis, and that requires collisions to have happened. And so kind of really trying to rethink that process a bit to be more aligned with systemic safety. And so I think that that's going to be a real necessity for Caltrans headquarters and the Caltrans local assistants to kind of team up and collaborate on to figure out how to merge those two concepts a little bit better.
And just to add to that a little bit, Leah, you also asked about the local level. So these approaches are scalable. So right now it's implemented for the state highway system, statewide, broken down to districts, but it can and actually has been used multiple times for local agencies also. And what we're seeing when we're applying it at the local level, sometimes the locals actually have slightly better data, are a little bit more detailed, and it gives even more opportunities. So we've developed that with several local agencies, and it allowed them to identify systemic concerns on their network that then they can figure out how to address.
Okay. The next questions are, I'm going to pull from Slido. There seem to be two sort of related questions that are also related to the conversations we had yesterday. I'm actually going to go with the second one here, and we can go back to the first one in a second. A lot of these tools focus on improving safety for communities and not with communities. How can these tools be improved to have residents directing improvements? Jill, do you want to talk about how Safe Story works with some of the engineering local agencies to address some of these community concerns?
Sure. So Street Story, currently on the tool, people can, for example, if Bike Bakersfield is interested in gathering information about what people are saying about hazardous places or near misses they've had. They do community outreach, they get this information, and they feed it to decision makers and professionals in their communities. We will be starting a project with the ATP program where in project applications for ATP, there'll be an opportunity for communities to enter ideas they have or things they'd like to see in terms of improvements that will go directly to the entities that will be applying for funds.
Great. And the second question is sort of a kind of related. It's a question on Slido. Studies have shown that drivers yield less often to blacks than whites, for example. how can race and gender be taken into account in these technical tools? Is there any way to incorporate race, gender, sociodemographic data?
Can I take a step?
Yeah, please.
Okay,
Yeah.
so because we've designed Street Story as a community engagement tool rather than just as a data repository, we've seen it's our intent that community agencies who know their communities much better than we do from the university, or maybe people from local agencies even do. So if a community organization that we've done a lot of outreach to works with constituents, and we target community agencies that do represent people of color, underserved communities, low-income communities, they're the trusted entities for gathering that information, either on paper or via the technology. And so then it winds up, and then they can communicate that to people who can make a difference in terms of policy, program, and so on, infrastructure.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience before we go back to Slido? Just raise your hand. Okay, we can continue with Slido. In high-quality bus transit corridors, it's often difficult to fit low-stress bike lanes in the right-of-way. What is the status of research on shared bus and bike lanes? Anyone?
I didn't see the tail part of the question, but probably not that great. So there is a significant challenge to do well-designed, high-quality research related to bike lanes, if it's shared with buses or not, if it's next to buses, because a lot of the bicycle facilities have been successfully and fortunately built in the past few years. So the data is only coming in more recently, and we haven't had too many opportunities to compile that. The second challenge is that many of the bicycle facilities, as they're being built, they're built in places where all of the public space was already accounted for. So there is a need to be creative in figuring out what is the right design for this specific location or for this specific corridor. And the reality is then that there's a wide variety of designs, and when we come to assess a specific one, we need to have a big enough number of locations that are similar to be able to say what is the impact. So from the research side, we find it very challenging to have data that's been collected over a long enough time, and also to batch together designs that are similar enough so that we can feel confident that we're referring to the safety attributes of a specific design.
If I could just add something too, I think more of an umbrella topic of this is also curbside management. And so something for us to be kind of thinking about and following as complete streets planners and engineers, that's kind of the next set of tools, right? The same way we've done layered networks and typologies for the curb to curb for streets to do complete streets planning, we're going to do complete curb planning, and really thinking about not just having it as the parking lane, but as kind of a flex zone that we can repurpose. And there's a lot of kind of new research and tools that are being developed in support of that kind of umbrella area too.
Great, thank you. For the next question is for you. The intersection evaluation model, is it applicable to highway ramp locations? For example, people walking across ramp entrances or exits?
Absolutely. So I also want to emphasize, and that maybe also relates to the race question of yielding, that these are still methodologies that are being developed. So we have demonstrated the capability to do that at actually just one location, and it works well there, but we still have not demonstrated that it's generalizable and something that can work in other places. In concept, this can also be applied to ramps and many other locations, but we're still early in the research to be able to do that. And going back to the yielding and race, so again, that's not something that's currently incorporated in these methodologies, but as we're able to demonstrate that it works well, those are things that we can think together to see what are other ways to address yielding.
Thanks, Ofer. The next question, we're to try and recognize some of the rural communities who may not have a lot of representation. So I'm going to skip to the bottom for Jerry. And this is from Slido. Our county is resistant to making space on their roads or are generally disengaged. How did you convince your community to invest and make space for ATP?
I love that it said that I did that by myself, but I certainly didn't. Definitely worked very hard. Well, we have a very invested and engaged community that cares about bicycling and walking, and so we're fortunate in that way. And there's certainly a lot of work to be done, and I think there are many people out there that are not engaged that I wish they were, and that they would take time out of their daily lives to get involved and promote active transportation. So I think that it definitely starts there with community engagement and passion, and then working with the local leaders. And I think planning is a really key part of that, is having a really good plan that sets out some direction and a vision for where those gaps can be closed and what kind of opportunities that can create, both from an economic development standpoint and just from a community health standpoint.
Great, thank you. We have an outstanding panel with tools to discuss. Now's your chance. I'm going to throw it back to the in-house audience. Raise your hand if you have a question. We'll find a microphone for you. Yes, in the middle. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Brenda from Caltrans. We've talked a lot today
Put the microphone up to your mouth so we can hear you.
Hi, I'm Brenda from Caltrans. We've talked a lot today about safety versus vehicle and pedestrians. I'm curious about safety studies about multi-users within that bike space or that multi-user space, especially given the increase of motorized bikes, scooters, in that pedestrian space. How do we also take it to the next level and say, within that bike pedestrian routes or safety areas, how do we make them safer for the multi-users within that, given our ADA or bikes, peds? How do we improve safety with multi-users?
Great question. So as our tools improve, the challenges also get more difficult. Anyone want to address the challenges of multi-use scooters, shared mobility services?
I can try, and I'm brave enough to try because we don't really have an answer. But it introduces a lot of complexities as expected. Because also the idea of designing complete streets, that by itself introduces complexities because we need to design for a wide range of users, and now it's another new mode that's still emerging and evolving. One way that we utilize to try to think about it is going back to slides about a safe system approach and looking at just like that long narrative that we had of what we would want, and then breaking it down to a more linear framework of these are the layers of buffers that we would need to incorporate into our system if we want to provide safe mobility opportunities for emerging mobility modes. So we want to make sure that the design is supportive of these modes that are coming. We want to make sure that the operations take that into account, and we want to make sure that the vehicles are able to provide that protection for non-occupants also. So we don't really know, but when we get lost, we go back to that framework and see that we can kind of check efforts. We haven't done any of that, but efforts are done across the different aspects of the system so that we can accommodate these modes. To add to that, despite of the challenges, it also introduces an opportunity because the infrastructure, as we're all kind of recognizing, is not necessarily able to accommodate these modes right now. So it does provide an opportunity to rebuild some of the environment, and if we're doing that, we can do it in a way that's much more mindful of the different modes that use the transportation system, and how can we build a system that no one will be severely or fatally injured on, given the new set of assumptions.
I want to echo in seeing this as an opportunity as well. I think there's a couple other things that I'd add. One is just the mode shift opportunity, right? So the interest, I was in Austin this summer for the ITE conference, and just the sheer number and variety of people who are using scooters, for example, and obviously there's some real safety concerns with it, but some real opportunity. The data piece of it too, our ability to understand origin and destination and route choice that comes with these is really powerful. So making sure you're acquiring that when they come into the communities and harnessing that. And then on the infrastructure piece of it, because we don't want them on the sidewalks, right? This modal, the speed differential and concerns with that. So looking for quick build opportunities to really prioritize the locations where these devices are, and then really focusing on the intersections, right? So the importance of protected intersections and at a minimum 2-stage turns, and really doing some education and providing some basic facilities for being able to make left turns comfortably, or some early components that I think are going to be important for safety.
Great comments. And we're able to collect more and more data, I think, as Megan said, to try and learn more about who some of our users are. We have some additional questions. Microphones. Oh, you got, okay, great. Go ahead. Sure, stand up, please.
Hi, so one thing that's coming to mind for me is we live in an area with very sprawly communities with high arterial speeds, as well as a lot of rural roads with very fast speeds. So for example, a bike lane was just added to a rural road and all the neighbors are calling to complain because how much the speeds of the vehicles have increased when the road got wider. And so until how we set speed limits changes, what are some suggestions and tools for getting around that when we can't just lower the speed limit?
Okay, so lowering the speed limit, address.
Build the infrastructure immediately.
So it's some kind of interim policy to deal with the speed limit issue on high-speed facilities, growing facilities, auto-focused facilities? Is that kind of?
Yeah, it's kind of, I guess I might push it not so much question.
Grab the mic, that's okay.
So one is maybe tools for like rural roads where when you add a shoulder, you add some bike lane, the speeds increase. So it's increasing the danger for everybody, but you really need that space for bicycles, particularly in spots where there may not be budget or right of way to add a trail or an alternative route. And then the other is for sprawling communities with high-speed arterials. Until changes happen where we can set lower speed limits on those without the speed studies, what are some tools that we can use to address that on those high-speed arterials?
Okay, so two questions about tools related to high-speed facilities and adding ATP infrastructure.
Sure, I'll start with that. Just to acknowledge that setting the speed limits is not going to be a panacea. Without physical infrastructure changes, as long as the design speed for the facilities is still high, people will still tend to drive towards the design speed. So in addition to adding bike lanes, it's also important to look at where things can be added, like narrowing lanes. Narrowing lanes in general tends to slow down vehicles. So considering where that can be done acceptably, within the design guidelines of the jurisdiction, or where guidelines can be updated, is important. There's also other traffic calming measures that can be considered as well, especially around the areas of intersections. We've seen things like bulb outs. Those are things to consider along arterials as well. There's a whole suite of opportunities there too.
A couple that I wrote down specifically are dealing with channelized right turns. We see these kind of major arterial intersections, and thinking about ways that you design the pork chop to have it be more like the approach to a roundabout, so that you're really slow on approach and have a separate yielding location for the crosswalk, and then also for the entry to the street that you're turning onto, as well as potentially raising the crosswalk across that. So even in that context, being able to make those more comfortable for pedestrians. And then the pedestrian hybrid beacon, I think, is something that we're just starting to see in our toolbox, and really does have a place on those arterials, and thinking about that not just in terms of a reactive hotspot, but also systemic. So what are the locations that could really benefit from that proactively, and doing more of those, and also making sure to do education as you roll those out, because we do know that the first few that you put in a community need some education around how to use them too.
I saw a bunch of hands, yes.
Hello, Tony Dang, California Walks. I know I'm the one that is encouraging no comments, but I really just have to make this comment. I'm just really disappointed at how the questions around race and gender are being swept under the rug in this panel. And while Street Story is great, the sort of community source data is not afforded the same respect as data generated from tools developed by researchers, planners, and engineers. So I want to, ask you guys directly as researchers, planners, and engineers, why the hesitancy to directly incorporate issues of race and gender? Because what gets measured gets counted, and that's what directs resources in this country.
Great question. Anyone?
I can try. At least for me, there's no hesitancy. So the hesitancy may have been more related to where we are in the development of the tool, and we're still trying to establish the technological capability to identify pedestrians and bicyclists, and it comes with its own set of challenges. Once we establish that, then we can definitely try to consider or try to see how we can do so. The hesitancy is more because of where we are in the research. So not necessarily because we're trying to ignore that problem. As it relates to the tools, we are, as researchers, very limited to the information that we have access to. And it's a very challenging, also from a university perspective, it's challenging for us to collect a lot of data. So the data would usually come from the agencies. I do want to say that whenever we have opportunities, we do try to articulate that, and a lot of the work that Jill and her team has done has tried to, or has recognized that in their kind of efforts. But I appreciate your comment. Despite what I said about the hesitancy, this is something that we need to do better on. So thank you.
I'd like to add to that as well. I think as consultants, we work for a variety of clients, and not speaking to any particular client here, but we find that with different clients, we're working to educate them as well on some of these things. And we're definitely aware of these issues and incorporate those, but different people are in different places, and we push them along. But the more that can be done out there to bring them along will help that as well.
And I think specific to the prioritization that we were discussing for the systemic tool for Caltrans, that was something that we really collaborated, that I would argue that we kind of at least brought the attention to, and then really collaborated with everyone to agree that it was important. And so while the data itself and the crash data and the contextual data didn't have that, the prioritization process that we went through to kind of say which of the locations would rise to the top overtly did have those as critical goals for that. And so that is baked into the process already. More obviously can and should be done, but it was a critical component of it at the start as well.
And one of the things that we want to, sorry, John, one of the things that we want to look at with Street Story is I think that in the first, it's been around for a year, and in our process of working with partnering with real grassroots community agencies, one of the things we've heard that we haven't been able to resolve, that we need to resolve, is that in order for communities to do, for some community agencies to do outreach, they need funds to do that. And we don't have funds to give them. So it's a situation of asking people to do more with no more. So I think funding gets tied into that picture as well, and we'll continue to figure out how to address that.
Yeah, and one other comment, I've looked at plenty of sorters reports and traffic collision reports, and race isn't one of those things that's collected when there's an incident. So until we start collecting more data, it's difficult for these folks to incorporate it into their models and their tools.
It's been collected over the last, 10 years or so, maybe fewer, it's been collected, but it's not really robust.
Great. John?
I'll build directly on that. John Ciccarelli, Bicycle Solutions, and one of the Safe Track safety evaluators for the state. Switters in particular, is your feeling that current field data items in Switters, I'm talking about the summary level table data, is sufficient to really understand what went on in a bicycle or pedestrian involved collision? I'm thinking in particular knowing where in the crosswalk relative to the curb, relative to which lane the collision occurred is sufficient, and if not, what is and can be done about that? And then the second question was spurred by the scooter thing. Scooters, the shared vehicles that are corporate provided, it occurs to me there might be an opportunity there. So this is kind of like a question, comment thing. Has there been any thought given to collecting additional fine-grained data from these mobility devices? I'm thinking of accelerometer tracks, so you know how the vehicle was being driven for its entire ride. That's not a lot of data to collect. It would be enormously powerful to be able to analyze that in an automated fashion. So two-part question.
Yeah, additional data collection.
First one? So no, Switters does not have the information, or the summarized information does not give us what we need to understand what were the dynamics in a bicycle crash and also not in a pedestrian crash. We don't have enough information about the location. We don't understand exactly where it happened. So it imposes a lot of challenges for us. We do believe and have some evidence that's the case, that a lot of that information is available in the narrative.
And to the specific question of race, it is collected in a crash report. It's just not in the summary level data that's easily accessible by automated means. It's in the narrative.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
No, it's in the-
I think there might also be a code for that, but it's not sure how well it's documented. But the narrative is the key, because when someone got into a crash and you ask them what happened, there's a story to it, and there's a sequence of events, and there's some circumstances that even for vehicle crashes don't always come up in the summary, but the level of detail that is provided in the coded variables is much, much lower for pedestrian and bicycle crashes. So we actually don't really understand what happened. The narratives, again, they do have that information, and we've recently or are completing an effort to assess what information can be extracted from that. This is specifically work with Jill about pedestrian and bicycle crashes, but it's also true in general. There's a lot more information that is not available to us as researchers that is in the narratives, and there are many techniques today to extract insights from those narratives. With respect to your second question, I again fully agree. Even though it's sometimes considered, oh, these are big fleets, corporate fleets, that is a concern by itself. But with respect to the opportunities it provides to get more data, to understand something about exposure, we spend years developing pedestrian exposure models and bicycle exposure models for cities and for the state. Here, many of these operators actually have that data already. So we don't need to try and dedicate many efforts to understand how many people are using these, where these fleets actually already have that information. And if you add on top of that speed and other attributes that are coming from these operators, it would put us in a much better position to provide better safety buffers. So I agree.
Great. So some of that leads to one of the Slido questions that may be related to changing how we're collecting data in terms of state or regulatory changes that could support some of your efforts. But I'd like to really address the more popular question where yesterday talked a lot about equity, and there's a couple of people who are really appreciating the technical and practical aspects. But the question is requesting that each of you speak about how you incorporate equity into your work.
Sure, I can start with that. You saw a little bit of the technical side here. I want to expand beyond that, though. Part of what we do as well when we're developing plans, and especially working with communities, is to present those and get feedback from the community. Part of what we're doing is tailoring our outreach to the communities and ensuring that what we have is accessible by all, regardless of level of income, access to the internet, language, and things like that. So to expand a bit beyond the technical side, it's not just a technical analysis; it's the outreach and the other aspects of it as well that are important.
I think we also understand the importance of the data-driven aspects of this, but understanding that the data has at least 25% underreporting that's associated with it. And so the need for us to take the collision data is one of several components. And so making sure that we're doing perception surveys and really weighing that just as heavily as we are what the data is showing. And I think systemic safety is a real good component of that. So we were able to take maybe where we do see that collisions are reported and where we do see some data, but really to extrapolate that for the context, but also for kind of the community feedback that we're hearing. And totally to echo what Rod's saying, the Tuesday night meetings at the library are just not working. We continue to have some projects that we work on that we're asked to do that, and you have 10 city staff and consultants show up and 2 community members. And so making sure that you're really aware of kind of who those community partners are. More and more we have kind of the advocacy organizations or the community organizations actually on teams with us. And I think it's really important that those groups are also paid for their time, right? So the kind of understanding that if you want people to be able to show up at a 9 a.m. meeting on a Thursday to have a conversation with stakeholders, that there needs to be some compensation for their time, and we've been able to see some benefits to that. So just a couple examples.
Thank you for the question, and for me it's also an opportunity to do a better job in replying to Tony's question. So I think for me and my team, I think we're just too close to the board, and we're not being asked that question enough. So we're going to go back and try to see how we can do better on that.
Both with Street Story and with our community pedestrian safety training project that we do in partnership with Tony and his group at CalWalks. One of the things we do is, one of the main things we do is prioritize underserved communities. And so we start with an analysis of or sort of a look at what communities are interested in working with us, but then also we look at where they are on the scale of being low income or having people of color or being underserved in terms of geography. And that's sort of that's the bottom line we use in order to choose neighborhoods or communities. We target those agencies, we target those communities. We work with people on the street who know the communities better than we do. And I think we also need to do a better job in sort of strengthen the way that we actually translate what we're doing and what we're gathering and what we're giving out.
So I have a different perspective than they do from as a transportation planner. You know, I mean, I have a different. I'm kind of like the odd man out with this presentation here because they have very data-driven kind of stuff, and I'm just a transportation planner. But you know, we are working on, you know, through the HEP, identifying disadvantaged communities and conducting non-traditional outreach efforts. Getting out there, talking to folks. We conduct surveys. We do walk to school day events, promote Bike Month, and all that is sort of kind of boots on the ground outreach, and that's generally the way that we approach these things. We do, I think, for a rural area, rather progressively have a performance-based tool for prioritizing active transportation projects, and equity is one piece of that. You know, when we talk about equity in our county, we have, you know, we're not a super diverse county, but we certainly have pockets, and we try to outreach to them, and we have prioritized projects there in conjunction with the ATP. One thing that we do have, and we recognize that through our tool, is we have a really high senior population. So that's another area where we're trying to work into, you know, our outreach efforts and that type of thing.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah, please.
We've also paying attention to language, and so we are translating Street Story into Spanish this year. This paper version is already in Spanish, and our workshops, about half of our outreach workshops are done in Spanish. And we've used other languages as well where we've needed to.
Great. Other questions from the audience? We have about 5 minutes left. Please, Candy. Microphones. We've got a runner.
I appreciate the effort in trying to answer some really hard questions. And I think that sticking with the equity question and the importance of it is, last night we had dinner and we literally talked for almost 5 hours straight about the impact of what happened yesterday. And for somebody like myself, who works with tribal governments solely, my takeaway yesterday, what I understand now, is that I don't fully understand. Mm-hmm. I work with disadvantaged, underserved communities every single day as a lead agency. I think that's what is being said. I loved your thought, we're too close to the board. Like, I love that concept. I know the responsibility that when I go back, the heaviness on my shoulders is so much heavier now. Because I think what we need to do is ask much harder questions, talk more about history, talk more about why we are at the place we are. When, I can't remember which panelist kept saying, maybe it was Tamika, those that have historically gotten less should be now, in the future, be getting more. That is such a bold statement, but it's so true and it's so honest, and we can't be afraid to have that. So I guess my question to you is, after hearing how valuable and how important social equity and reaching out, outreach is great. What did you do with the information? As a multi-cycle ATP evaluator for multiple years now, that is my biggest deficiency I see in that application scoring process. I know we're not talking about that wherever Lori is. I'm not going off on that tangent. I'm just saying, information back from your communities is great. What did you do with it? Show me how you took that information, took it, don't consider it, don't evaluate it. What did you actually do? As a tribal liaison, everything about what I do after yesterday is shifted because of this symposium, because of the impact of how important the human factor is.
I think we have your question, and this is also related to another question on the slide. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how Street Story fits into the process, where it's taken in, and how we can act on some of this information or collect additional information.
Mm-hmm. Sure, so it's a really good point. I mean, the just collection of data is useless if it's just collected and stored, right? So I brought up Bike Bakersfield and the group in Humboldt County because they are really trying to use the data that they're doing outreach to collect to inform the professionals in their communities about changes that need to be made, or about grants that need to be fed into, or the grants for ATP, for example, or education encouragement grants to the Office of Traffic Safety. I think that there are other agencies that have used it precisely to gather data and for ATP grants, and we'll be testing that as well in the coming year and a half with this new grant we have. So I think that using this as a way to fulfill community engagement requirements that are part of the ATP grant is a really useful way, because it can go directly from here to there. We'll also, and we do provide technical assistance around how to gather it, how to use it, how to analyze it. So we're not just saying, here's a tool, take a look at it. We are providing continual technical expertise in the analysis and in the grant writing as well. And Tony and his group are instrumental in that piece.
There's a trust component to this too. And so if we're going to come at this and say, oh, we want to be that much more authentic and engaged with the community at the planning level, but then 10 years goes by before we actually see anything on the ground and be built, you really erode trust pretty quickly. And so I think of a couple examples where that's been much better. So one is on the Yellow Brick Road project in Richmond, where that was a very integrated community planning effort, but then followed immediately by quick build efforts to get things on the ground. Another one's been in the Tenderloin on Safer Taylor, and the effort to put a living preview in as part of the community process to design this with the community, not for the community. The city already had money for the ultimate design and construction of the project when the planning process started. So the ability to go very quickly from the planning and concept design into actual construction was there, and I think the trust process, both in terms of the community members that were part of the planning development, as well as the ability to actually see something happen as a result of it in a very narrow time frame, is really, really important. And just one other thing that I think is important is also the things that we can internally control within our agencies and our firms. And that's something that we're trying hard at my firm to be thinking about, is who we're hiring, who we're recruiting, what campuses we're on as we go into this kind of recruiting process, for this season, making sure that we're actually trying to get a more diverse set of staff internally, right? To make sure that we have a broader variety of diverse perspectives with staff members that we interact with every day, and to make sure that the communities that we're working with, that we're more representative of kind of those community members in terms of the people they see in front of them at the public meetings and other ways.
Thanks, Megan. Unfortunately, Carl is literally breathing down my neck at this point. So I know that we have it's on a very tight schedule. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
And Kayvon, you've done a masterful job, but those participating by webcast do know I was keeping a 3-foot respectable distance between my nose and his neck. I had mentioned my colleague Christine Kehoe earlier for being here for both days, and I noticed that my colleague on the California Transportation Commission, Tamika Butler, is also here for the full second day as well. Tamika, thank you for carving out the time. In 30 seconds, we're going to break for lunch, but here's the decision I have. We're either going to have a lot of fun raffling off this wonderful Apple X phone, or if Megan can come forward, we think Megan may have lost her phone. Oh, it's right here. Oh, great. Thank you. Megan is kind of a killjoy. She's not letting us raffle off her phone. Thank you all. In 1 hour and 12 minutes, we'll come back.